I wonder if I could seek the leave of the House for the parts and clauses to be taken as one question in this morning's business under the trans...
So you are seeking leave for there to be one debate?
One debate.
And one question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't actually stated what the business of the House is. Might I do that, then we put the leave?
Overly keen. Thank you, Mr Chair.
No, I don't think we shall have any discussions. The House is in committee on the Trans-Tasman Proceedings Bill. We have leave sought for there to be one question. Is there anyone opposed to that course of action? There is not. So the question is that parts 1 and 2, schedules 1 and 2, clauses 1 and 2 stand part. You are seeking the call, the Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
There was another member on his feet last night, and I was hoping that he would continue with the call because it was such an interesting contribution to the debate. I can't remember his surname, so I can't say. Perhaps one of my colleagues could help me out. Anyway, no, it wasn't. Anyway, so, but no, seriously, I do have a serious question to ask, and one of my colleagues made a contribution on the first reading last night, Raymond Hall, and the point that he was making was in relation to some concerns that had been raised by Chapman Tripp in the public arena prior to the Trans-Tasman Proceedings Bill going to Select Committee. And I alluded to it myself in the first reading, but it was at the end of my contribution on that, and I said that I would deal with it once we got to the committee stages, because it is, as my colleague Raymond Hall made the point very well, I thought, is that it's actually quite a tricky area. So let me just perhaps run back over the end point of my contribution on the first reading debate. And this is the Chapman Tripp publication, Trans-Tasman Integration, Court Proceedings and Enforcement. And what they state is the proposed recognition and enforcement of regulatory sanctions is perhaps the most controversial part of the regime. The proposed reforms partially displace the long-standing rule that domestic courts do not enforce penal as opposed to compensatory laws of foreign states, because to do so is contrary to the principles of independent sovereignty. Now, the point that my colleague Raymond Hall made last night was that under the proposed reforms, some of the Australian regulatory penalties imposed by courts really now can be seen to be directly enforceable in New Zealand courts and vice versa, in the same way as our civil judgments. But the point that he was making, and this is the point that's really elucidated in this commentary, is that the difference in treatment between regulatory regimes based around civil penalties and regulatory regimes based around criminal penalties are going to be treated differently under the new regime. And so the civil penalties test will be basically there will be cross-border reach unless it's expressly excluded, and that is dealt with in subpart 7, I think it is, of the bill, and that's what the part of the bill that I'd like the Minister to focus his attention on. Clause 68, I think it is, and Clause 69, and then the and subpart 5, I think it refers back to as well. And for criminal penalties, it's going to be where they're included in the regulatory reach. So, on one hand, if sanctions are framed as civil pecuniary penalties, they will be directly enforceable unless specifically excluded by order in council, a negative list approach. Sanctions framed as regulatory regime criminal fines will be directly enforceable only if declared to be so by order in council, a positive list approach. And I think it would be worthwhile to have on the record of the House why the distinction is applying in this legislation, and I think that would be an extremely useful contribution to an understanding around how this will work in practice. And the reason that I'm asking for this is that the way Chapman Tripp sort of carried on was that they basically said that it was not obvious that the difference in treatment was warranted, because for some civil penalties versus criminal penalties arguments, they're literally going to be dancing on a head of a pin. And they use the example here of a fine under Section 40 of the Fair Trading Act, which is a criminal penalty, but a fine under Section 80 of the Commerce Act is a civil penalty. And I think it's quite an interesting point, and I think it would be really worthwhile if the Minister would contribute to our understanding of why the difference between the two regimes is being implemented. Mr Chairman.
Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
Why this is being implemented with respect to the single Trans-Tasman Proceedings Bill. And I think it's actually quite an interesting argument, and they take it a little bit further. And the question is, as a matter of broader principle, one might ask when and to what extent direct and mutual enforcement of regulatory penalties is desirable. So this is really the second issue. The first issue is the distinction between the civil and the criminal penalties. The point that Chapman Tripp go on to make is that where those court judgments relate to regulatory proceedings, the domestic regulatory systems of both New Zealand and Australia will have a broader reach, but this does not ensure or even seek to ensure that the respective regulatory systems will promote the same policies or pull in the same direction. And so what they raise in this article is that there is a risk of cross-cutting rather than streamlined regulation in areas such as competition law, securities regulation and consumer protection. And as I also said in the first reading on this bill, it was in my role as Minister of Commerce that I welcomed the introduction of the Trans-Tasman Bill, the Trans-Tasman Proceedings Bill, on the basis that a lot of the work that would be seen to be able to be concluded under it would fall within the ambit of my concern in that area. But the point that they make in this article is that anecdote suggests that New Zealand and Australian regulators are still a long way from sharing a common mindset or working in a truly coordinated fashion. And they say that the New Zealand Commerce Commission is unlikely to accept arguments that a New Zealand penalty should be reduced to take account of penalties imposed in Australia in respect of the same or related conduct. Likewise for the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, and perhaps in time a regime of mutual enforceability will foster a joint approach by regulators in such situations. For now, one can expect a somewhat imperfect overlap as the effects of closer coordination but not single source regulation are felt. And I don't necessarily agree with Chapman Tripp on this point. I think that sometimes we leap to an end conclusion without seeing if there are intermediate steps that we can take along the way. And in many respects, I prefer the graduated approach that this legislation seems to favour, which is to have the mutual enforceability through the Trans-Tasman Proceedings approach, rather than to have a single set of regulation applying across ASIC and across the Commerce Commission and indeed the Securities Commission. We have moved a long way, and as I also said in my first reading speech, the mutual recognition of securities offerings, those sorts of advancements that were taken under our government, I think are going to benefit from the platform that this establishes. But I think it is worthwhile for the government to place on record why a response to this particular issue, because it is one that commentators, I think, will continue to reflect on as the legislation comes into force. Mr Chairman, I think that the legislation as a whole is one that we absolutely welcome, and as I said again in the first reading, I was the Minister who was fortunate enough to be able to sign the original agreement on behalf of the New Zealand Government, and that is something that obviously someone in my situation would regard as an absolute privilege to do. And so we're very pleased that the Government has taken up the legislative requirements to match the legislative requirements